Good afternoon. Welcome back to Rio Grande Perspectives. My name is Chris, and today, God willing, we will take up the continuation of our discussion about Paul of Tarsus. Last time, I just sort of laid out the general outline, and it seems best to me for this episode, and I think for two more, God willing, to get into more specifics and to just limit ourselves to looking at some things individually. And today, what I had in mind is to just look at Paul in light of some warnings that Jesus gave us, multiple warnings, and some very peculiar signs, some red flags about Paul that I think deserve our attention. I wanted to say that I realize that I want to make these videos, and it's going to be, at least the intention then will be 4 videos in a row about Paul, and in a sense I feel it has to be done, but I also want to say that my hope is a much bigger picture. Personally, I don't like to focus so much on stuff like this. As I alluded to a number of videos back, I think we get a very important insight about life when we look at the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. And there are these 2 trees, and there's the tree of life, which is really what we need to strive for, and that's where we get nourishment from. And there's this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which has a serpent, which has Satan slithering around and presenting things in a certain way. And the fruit also is the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as I said before, my understanding of that is that when you're eating from that tree, that means you're looking into things that are true, but or you're looking into things, you're trying to discern the truth by examining good relative to bad, or examining bad relative to good. And that in itself, has some distortions to it. And then the distortions are really compounded when we have this adversary that is slithering about the tree and presenting things in a certain way and adding his narrative to it and his commentaries. So we have to be careful there. It doesn't seem to me that you can avoid sifting through all the stuff that's out there, these different truth propositions, examining different philosophies and religious movements, even looking at current events. This is not what I live and breathe and thrive on, but I do think it's important to do it for a bit because, as I said, Paul, when you really look at it, let's be real, Paul is the founder of Christianity, and he's basically one of the most influential people in world history. He's had far more influence on people than Jesus, and he's also been able to take other things that have exerted a lot of influence on us and then sort of reform them or recast, maybe is the word I'm looking for, recast them and sort of retrofit them to his philosophy. So, you could say that that Judaism has had a huge influence on people, but yet look what most people think Judaism teaches now because of Paul. So his influence is absolutely staggering, and that's why I think we need to take the time to examine this person and his legacy. As soon as something, God sends his truth into the world, he sends a communication, a word, and something pure and beautiful and good comes into our realm. And in very, very short time, something must, by the rules of this place, something must come in and present an alternative. There's a Garden of Eden, and wouldn't you know it, there's a serpent in there. Somehow it is the rules of this place or the rules of this age. It's just the way it works. If it wasn't Paul, it would have been somebody else. So you have Jesus, Jesus who effectively is a communication from God, right? The Word was made flesh, or even as the Quran says, Jesus was a word from God. So you have this amazing communication to people, and something has to come in there immediately. And you see this even in Jesus' parables, like the parable of the sower. Somebody sows the seed, and the birds have to swoop in and take it away. It's just the rules of this reality. And so we shouldn't beat up on Paul too much, because if it wasn't Paul, if it weren't Paul, it would have been somebody else. And on that note, I think I've also seen enough in the world to come to the conclusion that when people play these roles, a lot of times they don't quite know what they're doing. And it is so true when Jesus says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." That's a lot of times how it happens. All right, if somebody has some personal okay, we all have wounds and broken parts. We all have troubles. We all have a past. But there are some people have gone through things, or they've developed certain ambitions or appetites that make them especially susceptible to being pulled away in a bad direction. And if this is coupled also with great aptitudes or talents, they can, without directly wanting to be, they can be brought into extraordinary service for the dark. And that is my best take on Paul. I don't think that it happens, and this is true whether we're talking about Paul or really sinister people in world history, or we look at the news today and there's the constant torrent of people implicated in these awful things with Jeffrey E. Even Jeffrey, I don't think the way the world works. In fact, the evidence, like I said, I highly recommend Matt McKinley's channel, Quantum of Conscience, where he examines the way this reality works. And usually what happens is not a black van pulls up and hauls somebody inside and takes them away and gives them an offer they can't refuse, or it's not that a visible, literal devil emerges out of a poof of black smoke and tempts somebody to literally sign their name on a contract somewhere. We do have these things in our folklore, but really what it's getting at is these are artistic representations of the way that it's sort of like if a person is open to it, they will be led that way. There's just sort of a dark signal that is broadcast throughout this realm, and if people are receiving that signal, they move accordingly. And I think what you see in the case of Paul, there was something with him, something in his past, something people have gone through his writings in a investigative fashion, and they say this guy has strong symptoms of clinical narcissism. That isn't to say you can, make a definite diagnosis on somebody 2,000 years in the past by looking at their writings, but it does, a lot of people have said this, and I think there's plenty of strength in that case. He has times where he comes across as very conceited, very much overstating his credentials, very much a promoter of himself, and people aren't born that way. People are born in a good state. Something happened to Paul. Something happens to a lot of people. But somehow that signal got through him. There was a breach in his armor. There was that susceptibility, and he gets pulled along in a certain way. That's how these things work. It's not that Paul is some personification of evil. I don't want it to come across that way. In fact, we should realize that what happened to Paul can happen to anybody. We see the way that he dismisses in a very, nasty way. He dismisses the apostles, the real apostles. I don't know who they were, what they were. God knows. He just throws them under the bus. You see a lot of conflict, a lot of fighting words between Paul and what I'm saying are the real apostles, James, John, Peter. But that's just how it works. If somebody has that susceptibility, if somebody has some things, some open wounds, stuff can happen. And it's not like the devil said, "Hey, come here, kid. I got a deal for you." No, that's just not the way this reality works. It's much more subtle. I said he overstates his credentials. For one, he says he's a Pharisee. There's just, as I said in other videos, I spent about 10 years in Orthodox Judaism, and there is nothing that would suggest that there's a shred of truth in Paul claiming he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Look, it's not hard to access rabbinical writings. Several Jewish publishing houses have translated the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Midrash, the Siddur into fine English. All of this stuff is accessible. It's even accessible for free. Just as a case of investigation, you can look these things up. just check out Rabbinical Judaism, and you will see a refinement of character, a lot of humility that is really, really missing in Paul. You don't, I mean, there is some claim that Paul makes, or Paul makes it. He says that he studied under Rabban Gamliel. No way this happened. No way at all. You can look up for free, as I said. Go to Azarya.org. I'll leave a link. You can look up basically every piece of Jewish religious literature there is. You will not find the rabbis of that period talking the way that Paul does. Not at all. And they also don't quote from the Septuagint. They quote from the Hebrew Bible. And this means something. We'll get into that later, God willing. I hope I don't forget that point. You know, I've said this before. Get yourself a Siddur, a Jewish prayer book. This one is by Art Scroll Publishing. Art Scroll Masora. They have a lovely layout. It's very accessible, easy to follow along, and you can, the footnotes. It's rich. You can get into this and see for yourself who was the Sanhedrin. People think Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin. Absolutely not. It's so crazy to hear this. Such things can only be done when there's a colossal ignorance of what Judaism is. Summer afternoons, I should say, during the summer, Shabbat afternoons are spent reading Pirkei Avot. Here you can see some of it. Beautiful collection of rabbinic ethical teachings and moral maxims, and you get a sense of who these people were. Paul could not serve these people sandwiches. And look, I'm not a shill for Judaism today. As I said, I ended up feeling it wasn't for me. I'm definitely not pro-Zionist. There's a lot of this stuff I do not promote, and in fact, I'm quite against it. But to say that Paul was a rabbi, a Pharisee, no way. No way. I mean, for one, the scholarly consensus, when they look up all the citations that Paul makes of the Old Testament, it's generally said that he makes 98 quotes of the Old Testament. And of those, 95 don't even come from the Hebrew Bible. They come from the Septuagint, which is a shoddy Greek knockoff version. It's not the real Hebrew Bible. So this, when Paul in Philippians, he's going on about how he's a Pharisee of the Pharisees and that he's some big deal in Judaism. He excelled in the religion more than his peers. This only sounds plausible to people who have no idea. They have no idea how to even investigate and verify these claims. They're just taking it as he said it. But if you do know, if you have some background in Judaism, you know that this guy is lying. And that is a problem right off the bat, before we get anywhere. He is lying. He is not a rabbi. He's not a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He did not excel in his religion as compared to his peers, like he says. He's lying. And this itself is something that in other places Paul admits to lying. But he sees himself as having some sort of mission, and if lying is part of that mission, then no big deal. He also says that to the Jews he was as a Jew, to the Gentiles he was as a Gentile. He wanted to be all things to all people. I realize that there is, the pro-Paul school of thought is going to say, come on, you're making too much out of this. He's simply saying that he wanted to be approachable and to mingle with people and to be, diplomatic. There's, come on, you think there's something wrong with that? It kind of depends on the person. That's what I'll say. When I see a person is, without a doubt, he is lying about being a rabbi. He's not, you know what? Here's the other thing. Not only does he quote the Septuagint instead of the real Hebrew Bible, but I've said this before. Get any standard Bible that comes with footnotes and look for yourself. Go through Paul's writings. Look up the places where he quotes the Old Testament. And your footnote at the bottom there will tell you, okay, he quoted from, Deuteronomy, whatever. Then go look that up. Go look up where he's quoting from, and you'll see that he mangles it. He repurposes the text to fit his ideologies. This guy, there's so many problems here. And again, if he was just the weird crank down the road, I would not be bothering with this for many reasons. One, like I said, I don't think it's good to devote one's life to examining controversies. Take your Bible off the shelf, the one that has the footnotes in it. Go look up and see what Paul is doing to the text, because it is criminal. It is another case of dishonesty. And the other problem, before I forget, is that if Paul is to be believed that he persecuted the church, and this isn't some sort of huge embellishment or exaggeration on his part, what does that tell you about him? Like I said, people have to have something for the evil to grip onto them. There has to be openings. There has to be breaches in the person for that spirit to grab them and to pull them into service for it. And whether he just wished he could have persecuted or he really did it, I mean, that's some dark stuff. I mean, let me ask you, have you really wished to go out and beat up some Mormons? I mean, has that crossed your mind? You said, it would be a good time. Let's get the boys in the van and go out and just beat the hell out of some Mormons or some, just pick your favorite fringe church. Did that ever cross your mind? Almost certainly it didn't. I mean, it's a very, very rare person. And if that's not bad enough, it becomes even more problematic when we remember that the very, very early Jesus movement was not so different than just mainstream rabbinical Judaism of its time. I mean, Jesus himself said, listen to the Pharisees. They sit in Moses' seat. Jesus preached the Torah. We read in Acts that The apostles, Peter was able to preach in the temple. He was preaching about Jesus, making the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And at that point, all of these happenings were entirely within the context of Jewish culture. The audience was entirely Jewish. It said something like 3,000 men in one day accepted the faith. That's 3,000 Jewish men hearing Peter preach in the temple. And another time, what is it, 2,000 again or four? I didn't prepare those notes. I'm just talking extemporaneously. But you see, they were able to meet there. What I'm getting at is the early movement was so Jewish still that it would not attract much persecution. They were welcome to be there. They were not treated as minim. That would be sectarians. They didn't yet have that category appended to them. There was we're still centuries before the Trinity. If at that point, I get it that eventually in Acts of the Apostles, it starts to talk about some persecution, and then later on we know that the rift between Judaism and what the Jesus movement evolved into, that distance had grown great enough to where Jews could not consider the food of Christians to be kosher, or their wine to be kosher, or for Christians to be counting towards a minyan, or marriage between Jews and Christians that would also be isur, prohibited. But that was a long time in the making. So whatever early persecution of the church, it had to be by people who were very rare in that type of mentality. Like it would be a rare person to persecute somebody who is in their own nation and is still, differing by the tiniest sliver. Who does that? Judaism at the time, you had the Sadducees, which, they were way out there. They didn't believe in many tenets that are considered indispensable to Orthodox Judaism. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not accept the prophets as canonical. You had all these different groups. You had the Zealots. You had the Essenes. Whoever those early people were that were actually persecuting the Jesus movement, these had to be the dregs, the absolute dregs of Jewish society. And to whatever degree this attribution is true, we do find in I can't remember the chapter, but in Acts, allegedly Rabban Gamliel is said to, like, hey, just let these people go. If it's from God, why do you want to fight it? Do you want to fight against God? And if it's not of God, it'll fizzle out. To think, well, maybe we'll take this up again later, but my main thing is, Paul can't possibly be the purist that he makes himself out to be, because we would see it reflected in him quoting the Bible correctly. That would mean quoting the Hebrew Bible and not the Septuagint, and also not mangling the Bible. He would quote it and rightly transmit its proper meaning, that and he does the opposite of this 95 out of 98 times. He's not a purist. So who is this guy, and what's motivating him if he's really persecuting the early Jesus movement? And then he becomes basically the founder of the religion. Very, very strange. I mean, this alone, I mean, the lies, the story just does not add up. The lies from Paul, his own admission that he will be just whatever to whomever, he'll be all things to all people. Major red flag. Major red flag. And that's just the first. Because my contention is that Paul is exactly the man that Jesus warned us about. But go to Matthew 7. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he warns about a wolf in sheep's clothing, which would mean a destructive person, a subverter, a murderer, basically, a murderer and a destroyer in the disguise of an apostle, because Jesus uses, that sheep image, that metaphor is used time and time again in Jesus's parables about his followers, especially about the apostles. He says, I send you forth as sheep. So a wolf in sheep's clothing would be somebody who is actually devouring the flock, though they look like one of the flock. Maybe this is coming across very pedantic, but, part of me says maybe we need to talk about this, because how are people not seeing this? And what's very, very interesting, and I brought this up briefly in the previous video, is Benjamin. If we go to Genesis 49:27, Jacob is on his deathbed and he's giving his blessings to his sons, and he goes through each son, Reuben and Levi and all of them, gives them a blessing. He prophesies something about their future. When it comes to Benjamin, he says, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you know that what happens in the book of Judges is that there is a massive population reduction in Benjamin as a result of a very grisly crime involving I forget if it's a Levi or a priest. He has a concubine, and the concubine is abducted and violated in an awful way, and a very grisly story. And it will just suffice to say that news of this gets out. The perpetrator was a Benjamite, and I believe it happened in a village in the lands of Benjamin. And the outrage among Bnei Yisrael was so hot and severe that basically this started a civil war. The tribe of Benjamin was decimated, and ever since that time, even though some attempts were made to sort of much later to restore the population, which you can read about in the Bible, they just never really came back. They were always a tiny tribe. And I bring this up because the idea of Benjamin being the least keeps coming up in the Bible, right? They're the smallest tribe. The first king he brings up that his family is the least of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is the least of the tribes of Israel. And then what happens is, very, very curiously, Paul, that name Paul is the Latin word for least. And we know that his name is Shaul. I'm not aware of, as I alluded to in the first video, you do see these cases where Jews will have their actual Hebrew name, but in the Gentile world, often they will take a derivative name that will just come across as more, maybe not Gentiles so much, but it will just be less conspicuously Jewish. But how Paul ends up, in the case of Paul of Tarsus, how he ended up picking the name Paul when his real name is Shaul, that's interesting. I don't know how it got that way. But it's such an interesting coincidence because he ends up having a name that means the least. And it could be because Benjamin is the least of the tribes, but his name isn't Benjamin. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he likes to bring that up. I think he brings it up 2-3 times in his letters. But Shaul does not translate to least, it translates to asked. The tribe of Benjamin has this prophecy given to them by the great patriarch Jacob, where Benjamin would devour, that he would be a ravening wolf. So very interesting that when Jesus says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Coincidence? I mean, what would make Jesus say that? What would make Jesus say that? Was it just a whim? Did he go out on a limb on this one and just... because what we get is it's not simply wolves in sheep's clothing, but it's further specified that we are talking about ravenous wolves. And we also see that Jesus had a very serious commitment to not just say stuff. He said that God gave him a commandment what he should say and what he should speak. So that should also make us say, what then could it be that God is trying to convey to us through Jesus, his servant, and these words, that we are to be aware of ravenous wolves who are claiming to be prophets and who are false prophets. Okay, they're claiming to be prophets, but in actual fact they are false prophets and they are ravenous wolves. So even if this is all we had, who fits this category? Anybody come to mind? Anybody? If you had to make a list of all the people that have had any measurable impact on the world, who I'm going to say come from the tribe of Benjamin, because I think that this connection here is unavoidable. These words mean something, and I don't think Jesus is just accidentally blabbering. So what's going on? Do you have a better candidate? Somebody that claimed to be a prophet and an apostle, claimed to have visions? Let's go on. What we see in Matthew 24 is he says, "Then if any man shall say unto you, Behold, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. Believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and they will show great signs and wonders, so much that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you ahead of time. Therefore, if they say to you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not." Paul in Galatians 1:17, he talks about, in his own words, that he went away. He did not get his gospel from any man, that he spent time in Arabah. Translators have translated this either into Arabia or more likely Arabah, which would be like southern Israel, the Negev region. But whatever the case, Paul is saying that he got all his stuff by his solitude in the desert and communing with Christ. And in fact, that is the hallmark of Paul's whole story. He's saying that he was this big persecutor. He is on his way to Damascus to persecute Jesus movement people there. You know, they weren't called Christians yet, and they weren't Gentile. So that's why I'm, using this term Jesus movement. So he's on his way to Damascus. He has this miraculous encounter that, happens to him on that lonely highway out there in the wilderness. And what's interesting is this is visible Jesus, according to these stories, each time that Paul tells it in the Bible. You could look at Acts 9, you can look at Acts 22 and Acts 26. Each time the story changes in ways that cannot be reconciled into one story. And we'll get into that a little more. But one thing that is consistent in all of these versions of it is that Paul is the only one who sees Jesus when this happens. So it's a private revelation. His traveling companions, in one case, they can see the light. In some other telling of it, they can hear a sound, but they never see Jesus. It's just Paul. So Paul allegedly sees Jesus on the way traveling to Damascus. Paul, according to Galatians in his own writing, he says that he did not receive his gospel from men or from any man, but he got it from Christ, and he secluded himself in the Arabah, which, whether we go with Arabia or Arabah, is still a desolate solitude that, he allegedly spent some time in solitude and got his gospel. That's where he got his doctrines and learned everything. And so far, nothing I'm saying would be contradicted by mainstream Christians. This is just part of the Paul's story. All I'm doing is saying, hey, this is the accepted story about Paul, but don't you think this sounds very, very, very sketchy when we look at what Jesus told us to be on the lookout for? So Paul's in the desert. He sees Jesus and nobody else can see him. And it gets worse, because we find in Acts 22, Paul sees Jesus again in a secret way. In Acts 22, Paul undergoes a purification ritual in the temple, which is very strange given what Paul has said about the law in so many other places. So again, in fact, when you read Acts 22, it's clear that this is a case of Paul being a Jew to the Jews. And this isn't just I'm not just digging at Paul. All of the mainstream Christian commentators, in fact, they explain this otherwise very, very strange, seemingly self-contradictory action on Paul's part by saying, well, he was just being diplomatic, he was being a good sport, he was being a Jew to the Jews. Make of that as you will, but so when Paul is in the temple, which, Jesus warned us, if they say he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. Well, here's Paul in a very secret place. The temple is the most exclusive place that you could possibly be. The temple has places where Gentiles can only go up to a point in the outer courtyard. Then you have Jews can go, ordinary Bnei Yisrael, if they're in a state of purity. They have to be ritually tahir. They have to be pure. And this involves mikvah, and it involves, several things. Okay, so you can't just stroll into it. And then, that would be as far as Paul could go, since, if we're to believe that he is from the tribe of Benjamin, which is a weird thing to hang on to. And I think that is a detail that survives specifically to pin on Paul who he is. We'll get to that, God willing. But then you have other parts of the temple that can only be accessed by the Levim, and then further only by the Kohanim. And then, of course, you have the Holy of Holies, which can only be accessed once a year by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. So we're talking about a very secret chamber. And this is not my spin on this phrase. Now, what's going on with John Gill and other Christians who understand the secret chambers or secret rooms as referring to the temple is they're envisioning at some point in the future, this Antichrist is going to, pop out of the temple and make some claims that he saw Jesus and Jesus, gave him the authority and deputized him to now go out and rule the world, etc., etc. This would be a pretty common idea of the Antichrist. But why pin that on a future Antichrist? You already have Paul, who claims to have seen Jesus in a private vision while he was in the temple during his visit to the temple for this purification ritual. And in fact, I can't think of the proper term, but a lot of Christians throughout history have interpreted Matthew 24 as referring to things prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which, seems legit based on other things in that chapter. That's why that argument has so much strength. Now, it's also been very popular in Christian commentary to say that Matthew 24 refers to a time of troubles prior to AD 70, and it has a secondary meaning talking about the time of troubles at the end of the age, or the end of the world, which would be future yet. And so both of these interpretations of Matthew 24 have been very, very popular. You could say both of these are mainstream interpretations. And so if we are going to take Matthew 24 as at least having its primary meaning in that time period prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, well, we're in this place again where I invite you to name somebody then. Tell me somebody who could possibly fit this. Who has claimed to be a prophet? Who has claimed to be an apostle? Who has been a ravenous wolf? Who has claimed to see Jesus in the desert and gotten his teaching that way? Who has claimed to see Jesus in a secret chamber? Who? Who is there in this world that fits that description? Let me know. Put it in the comments. But if you're going to tell me, well, there was just some, nobody, Billy Bob Goldstein that, gave a prophecy to 15 people that never went anywhere. I don't, what I'm getting at is this has to refer to somebody significant. Okay, if you want to say, well, there was probably some troublemaker out there that got himself a little following and we just didn't hear about it because it didn't end up doing much. I don't think Jesus is going to waste time talking about things that don't matter and that don't correspond to people that actually had a major impact in the world. He's telling us about a wolf in sheep's clothing. He talks about the person being least in the kingdom of heaven because they make little of the law. Whoever breaks the law and teaches people to break the law will, whoever breaks the law, even the least of the commandments, and teaches others to disregard even the least of the commandments, he will be called least. In the kingdom, that's what they'll call him. And I think it is providence that Paul's name ends up meaning least. I mean, how many coincidences can there be? His name means least. He taught against the law. He taught people to break the law. And we'll get into that specifically, God willing, in the next episode, where we're going to talk about Paul and the Hebrew Bible and the law. I mean, think about this. Jesus said, "Think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no way pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." Now, according to Paul, the law lasted up until the cross. According to Jesus, the law is valid until heaven and earth pass away. Again, huge. There's no way you can reconcile these things. Either Jesus is right when he says that the Torah keeps going until heaven and earth are done, or, according to Paul, the Torah was not even really a nice thing. It was a trick from God, and it only lasted until the cross. You can't have both. It's one or the other. And on top of this, we have all of these red flags. It's like Jesus was literally warning us about Paul. In Matthew 7:23, Jesus talks about this, what we'll call Lord Christianity, where I've been thinking of what what to call the Pauline, like how do I describe the type of Christianity we get from Paul? And the best term I could come up with is it's a talismanic Christianity. Jesus, instead of being a teacher to teach us how to live in God's will, he becomes sort of a talisman. Paul's panorama has this idea like God doesn't really want us. However, we can still get in good with God if we have the talisman of Jesus. And Jesus is sort of like an amulet. It doesn't matter what you've done in your life or what you will do with your life. What matters, do you put this amulet around your neck? Do you clench this talisman, and this somehow changes your standing with God? Not like what Jesus says is just repenting and doing your very best to follow in God's will and do good works. In Matthew 7, verse 23, Jesus is talking about this sort of Lord, Lord Christianity, that in the judgment, this is it. It's judgment day. There's no redos. There's no time to say, oops, can I have another try at this? It's judgment day. And Jesus himself says that there will be a bunch of people saying, Lord, Lord, didn't we do miracles in your name? So, the miracles don't prove anything. Saying, Lord, Lord, making grand claims about Jesus, calling him Lord, calling him God, is not your ticket. It's not your ticket into the kingdom. In fact, considering Jesus to be God, as we get into this Trinitarian deity of Christ stuff in other places, I get that most people are ignorant of what they're doing, and they don't know how wrong they are. But that's not a thing to be doing. But the point here is, Jesus says, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity." And that word there, iniquity, is anomia. Anomia, from the prefix a, which would be, negating or the absence of. Nomia is from the word nomos, law. He's saying, depart from me, you lawless people, you people of lawlessness, workers of lawlessness. How is this not Paul? Paul's whole identity is the guy who presented a philosophy that is understood by all people as some alternative to the law of God, which is just so baffling. If you really believe that God gave tablets to Moses, that God, the originals, God wrote into the tablet what the law is, and the mountain was on fire, and it's quaking, and people are, dying from awe, and you believe that, and that's part of the heritage of faith, really, for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to think that some guy can come out of the desert and say this stuff is done away with. You can't. How does this happen? How does this happen that God presents the Torah in such a spectacular way, and it's attested to, like I said, in all three religions? Christians will at least pay lip service to this truth. But then because Paul said something, oh yeah, it says this and this and this in Romans or in Galatians, so I guess, I guess God and his criteria are just done away with. It's so crazy. So, this is pure craziness, and yet this is what's happening, and it's what has been going on ever since Paul won. But you don't have, he won for today. It's not a good ship to be on. You want to get off of that ship. Because this does not go well. And I know people are going to say, well, Paul never said the law is done away with. Look, there is no internally consistent, coherent use of the word nomos in Paul's writings. Yes, I know you can find a place where he says, do we make void the law through faith? God forbid we establish the law. Look, we have all seen politicians when they are called out, and Trump has done some things that are against the Second Amendment, and so people will say, Mr. Trump, why are you infringing upon the Second Amendment? And he'll say, I love the Second Amendment, I never infringe upon it. Well, this is basically Paul. He teaches people against the law. He paints a very dark picture about what it even meant for God to give the law. He paints a dark picture of God. He gets into conflict with the actual apostles, such that it's a huge thing and they have to have a meeting. He says the law brings death. Jesus said the law brings life. And, I'm not making this up. He got into huge trouble for this. He says that the Galatians have been bewitched for wanting to convert to Judaism. And so whatever Paul might say elsewhere in his letters that could be construed as supportive and upholding of the law, it's meaningless, and here's why. It's supposed to be ambivalent. That's by design, and as I've said before, it's not even necessarily Paul's design. Like I said, I don't think much of what Paul did is really his plan. I don't want to get into a big thing on this right here and go on a tangent, but I've just seen this too much in the world. So much that happens is not really what the individual is planning to do. It just turns out that way. Paul's writings about the law are just meant to be gibberish. They are absolutely meant to be gibberish. They're meant to mean many things. And I don't think that's his design. It could be his design, because after all, he did say that he wants to be all things to all people, but I don't think that's what's going on here. I think that whatever the Spirit is that inspires his writings, it meant to just put it out there to be able to be taken many, many different ways. And so it's meant to say these things that insinuate dark things about God that encourage people to disregard the Jewish Bible, that and yet also have these things where you can fall back on this and say Paul was pro-Torah. You can't have it both ways. It's like if somebody says that if somebody said, let me tell you about my teacher in third grade. She abused students. She, would hit them with a ruler and call them awful names and was cruel. And then 5 minutes later, the same person is saying, let me tell you about my teacher. She was great. She, was very helpful, very kind, always patient with students that were struggling. Well, what do you do with this? I mean, for one, even if you wanted to believe the good things that were reported about this teacher, you still have in your head all of these horrendous things. And so, once you start bad-mouthing a thing, and this is the whole reason why we have to be careful about what we say. The effect of our statements lasts for so long. And, it just takes a little bit of poison in a thing to make a little bit of poison gets put in there, the whole thing is poisonous. Paul's writings are meant to be ambiguous. The spirit that inspired him, the darkness that's here, meant for it to be this way. It is more probable that it's that way than Paul sitting down and stroking his beard and saying, how can I make something so deviously ambiguous? Not at all. No, he was just a vessel. He was a pen in the hand of the adversary. What's the proof? The proof is that nobody can agree on what it is he said. The minute the Reformation started, for the longest time, the church sort of, the church claimed absolute authority on interpreting everything in the Bible. And so, what Paul said could not be isolated and cause a whole lot of commotion. Once the church authority was challenged, then you have everybody expounding the Bible in a different way, and where this really makes a difference. I mean, people don't have really a difference of opinion on what Jesus was teaching, but where they have a difference is what Paul is teaching. And so you see this fracturing. It eventually gets to where you have hundreds, and then by many counts today we have 40,000 Christian denominations, and almost all of this has to do with disagreements about Paul. And you find that there is just no consensus in Christianity. What are Christians even supposed to do? What are the standards? One person thinks you gotta remain a virgin until marriage. Another person thinks you don't. It's all over the place. All over the place. It's so totally fragmented, so far from consensus, because within Paul's writings, there's no consensus. There's no consensus between a random chapter in his letter to the Romans and a random chapter in his letter to the Galatians. It's all by design. And it's just the way things went with Christianity. It's interesting that even in John it says, for the law was given by Moses, and here's the thing. It doesn't say, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. The Greek there says the law was given by Moses, Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Paul's influence was so great that it ends up having an effect on how other authors in the New Testament are even translated to us. Because John himself is not putting the law and grace in opposition to one another. But because Paul has made that the paradigm, now when people are translating John, they just do that automatically. Anyways, I wanted, like I said, to save most of the discussion about the Torah and Paul for the next episode. So I don't want to get into that too much today. But let's go back to Paul's conversion story, which changes each time. As I said, we got Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26. All three are different. In Acts 9, the light shines, Paul falls, Paul and the men hear a voice, and the men see nothing. In Acts 22, light shines, Paul falls, but the men see the light and do not hear a voice. In Acts 26, the light shines, all the men fall, Paul hears a voice. Some people, I'd say it's actually pretty popular in Bible criticism for people to say that Acts was written as a puff piece to present Paul in a good light. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think this might be a kind of tongue-in-cheek way of saying, look, it is true that this Paul guy came and eventually became, basically became the main guy. But it's things like this that make me wonder, did Luke, who is, traditionally said to be the author of Acts, did he, because think about this. You don't imagine that he got done writing Acts and noticed that each time the conversion of Paul happens, it's different? You got to give people some credit. Just because it happened long ago doesn't mean people were dumb. I think, if anything, this is reflecting probably what people noticed back then. Like every time this Paul guy would give his testimony on his conversion, it was always different. And is this a way of sort of wink wink telling people that something doesn't add up with this character? Something's not right. Another weird thing, the first miracle that happens to Paul is he is blinded, right? He's blinded from this experience going to Damascus. And the Jesus we find in the Gospels was taking people who were blind and giving them sight. You don't have a case of Jesus taking people who have sight and taking their eyesight away. This seems like an inversion. It's an inversion of Jesus. Just another one of these. How many weird things can keep on happening in this guy's story? And it gets worse. So that was the first miracle that happened to Paul. Then we read Paul's first miracle as a apostle. Basically an apostle means he's representing Jesus Christ. What does Paul do as his first miracle? He makes somebody blind. That's right, Acts 13:11, the first miracle Paul does is to take somebody's eyesight away. Just incredible. Incredible. This is an inversion of Jesus. Paul is an inversion of Jesus when it comes to the law. He's an inversion of Jesus when it comes to these miracles. His story changes every time. And he's this huge world figure who, in the wildest ways, matches what Jesus said to look out for. And people are going to say that I'm crazy. That's that is like the extra crazy cherry on top. Is a Christian watching this video is going to say that I lost my mind thinking this about Paul. Jesus talks about the blind leading the blind, and it's not a good thing. Paul is literally a fulfillment of this phrase, blind leading the blind, and he keeps leading the blind because I'm pointing out all these things about Paul, and people are blind to him. It's metaphorical blindness. We have a case in Acts 13:11 of literal blindness. It's incredible. Incredible. I'm just blown away by how Paul hits these points one after the next, one red flag after the next red flag, after the next red flag, over, just uncannily matches these bizarre warning. I mean, like, I believe it because that's how God works. You know, people think you're just going through life randomly. I mean, even things with the name you take, God saw it before you even, like, God knew that this guy would be named Paul before the world was made. You know, so he can deliver these warnings to us through his prophets, which he did. Jesus clearly warned us about Paul. If you're not convinced, pray about this. Consider these points again. We've looked at the wolf in sheep's clothing. We've looked at Paul's name meaning least. We've looked at his conversion in the desert. We've looked at his seeing Jesus allegedly in the secret chambers. We've looked at Paul's story changing all the time. It's just one red flag after another. And even the thing with the blind leading the blind. You know, Matt from Quantum of Conscience loves to quote Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. Of all the gin joints in all the towns of the world, she walks into mine. Of all these criteria laid out for us on whom to beware of, you mean to tell me that Paul just fits all these like a dead ringer, but he's still the good guy, and we've just got it wrong? That guy to look out for is yet to come. It'll be somebody else at some other time? Nah. No, I mean, it seems so obvious to me. Anyways, I hope this gave you some food for thought and that you got a blessing out of this. Again, I really want to emphasize that this is not what I love to do. I just think that it's something that has to be done at some point. God willing, we can go on to better things that pertain to the tree of life, and you know, not spend too much time mucking around in controversy and you know, forensics and you know, figuring out who the bad guys are. I'd rather look at good things, but as I said, some of this work should be done. It has a value. Absolutely, it does have a value when it's kept in its proper place. I thank you for listening. God bless you, and I hope you'll come back. Thanks a lot.